Before we get into this video, I just want to give my disclaimer. I mean no harm or disrespect to anyone involved or affected by the contents of this video. This is all information I have gathered online and I'm compiling into this one video. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka were the sadistic killing duo in the 90s. The couple were nicknamed the Barbie and Ken Killers by the media, as both of them were attractive-looking people. Paul Bernardo was born on the 27th of August, 1964, in Scarborough, Canada. Paul's family was very wealthy, but behind closed doors, they were dysfunctional. Paul's father, Kenneth, was abusive to all of his past partners, and especially to Paul's mother, Marilyn. Marilyn Bernardo began having an affair with one of her ex-partners, which led to the birth of Paul. So Kenneth was not Paul's biological father. Paul didn't find out that Kenneth was not his father until he was 16 years old. From this point onwards, Paul had a lot of resentment towards his mother. In 1975, Paul's father, Kenneth, was charged with child molesting, along with being charged for sexually abusing his own daughter, Paul's older sister, Debbie Bernardo. This caused Paul's mother to become very depressed. Marilyn withdrew herself from the family and from being the mother figure she once was. Despite all of this trauma in his childhood, Paul went on to live a normal, young adult life. Paul attended college and graduated. Whilst at college, Paul had a lot of different girlfriends due to his good looks. None of these relationships would last very long, as Paul would show abusive behaviour towards his girlfriends. In 1987, when Paul was 23 and Carla was 17, the two of them met in a restaurant. Carla and Paul immediately fell for each other. After the meal, the two of them ended up going back to Carla's hotel room and spending the night together. Paul again ended up being abusive towards Carla, just like he was with his previous girlfriends, but this time, Carla liked it. Carla encouraged Paul to be abusive towards her and other people. Carla was attracted to this mean and abusive side of Paul. In November of 1987, 2 months after meeting, Paul and Carla were engaged. Carla's family loved Paul and treated him like he was already part of the family. Paul spent more time at Carla's and with her family than he did at his own home. But unknown to Carla and her family, Paul would soon become a serial rapist. Between 1987 and 1990, Paul raped 10 girls and attempted rape 6 times. He also committed many different assaults, and these are just the confirmed numbers, so there could be many more, but people might not have come forward to report the crime. Before Paul was identified, he was known to the town as the Scarborough Rapist. Before Paul and Carla began dating, there had already been 3 attacks linked to the Scarborough Rapist. On May the 29th, 1990, police released a composite sketch of the Scarborough Rapist to the media. When the sketch was released, friends of Paul Bernardo were shocked by what they saw. Paul's friends immediately contacted the police and told them the sketch looked just like their friend Paul Bernardo. Police brought Paul in for questioning and requested a DNA sample, which Paul willingly gave. The DNA was sent straight to the lab to get tested, although due to this case being in the 80s, it would take much longer to get the DNA results back as it does now. In the time it took for the results of the DNA tests, Paul and Carla had already moved from Scarborough to St. Catherine's to live with Carla's parents while they saved money to get their own house. St. Catherine's wasn't far away from where they were previously living. Around this time, the sexual assaults and rapes had stopped in Scarborough, but a few started happening in St. Catherine's. The rapes and sexual assaults that were happening in St. Catherine's were never connected to the ones that happened in Scarborough until it was too late. Carla's parents, who they were living with, did not suspect a single thing about Paul. They all loved him, especially Carla's younger sister, Tammy, who saw Paul as a big brother. Paul wanted one thing, which was Tammy, as she was a virgin, and that's the one thing Carla was not. So he began pressuring Carla that he wanted her. To please him, Carla would help Paul spy on her younger sister Tammy while she was getting dressed. Eventually, Carla felt so guilty that she couldn't give Paul her virginity, so she agreed to help Paul take Tammy's. Paul and Carla devised a plan that Carla would steal some drugs from where she worked as a vet. Carla soaked a rag in a drug called holophane to hold over Tammy's face, so she would stay sedated during the attack and rape. Holophane is a general anesthetic which causes the loss of reflex and consciousness. This drug is used in veterinary practices for most surgeries on animals. After Tammy was sedated, Paul began sexually assaulting and raping her, while telling Carla, Tammy's older sister, to join in. The whole assault was recorded by Carla. Eventually, Tammy began to regain full consciousness, and she began vomiting and then choking on her own vomit. Paul and Carla panicked, so they quickly hid the camera, dressed Tammy, and then called 911. When the paramedics arrived, Paul and Carla told them that Tammy was a wild child, always partying and mixing drugs. Tammy was rushed into the hospital, but in the early hours of the morning, on Christmas Eve, Tammy passed away at hospital. Despite there being a chemical burn on Tammy's face, her death was ruled as accidental. Paul and Carla claimed the burn on Tammy's face was from the rug when they were trying to resuscitate her before paramedics arrived on scene. A month later, Carla and Paul moved into their own home. Tammy's death was the beginning of a series of sexual assaults and murders. These were mainly targeting young women for their virginity. As the crimes continued, Carla began calling Paul her king, and Paul began calling Carla his slave. Paul had the power in the relationship, as Carla loved him and would do anything to please him. 2 months on, and Paul was still confident that he had gotten away with all of the Scarborough rapes, as his DNA was still not tested. This made Paul feel like he could commit more crimes and still get away with it. On the 15th of June, 1991, 2 weeks before the couple's wedding, Paul found their next victim, Leslie Erin Mahaffey. Leslie was abducted from her garden. She was lured into Paul's car with a cigarette. It was the early hours of the morning, and Leslie's parents had locked her out of the house due to her missing her curfew and being late home. When Paul returned home, he woke Carla up, telling her he had a surprise. And there, standing next to him, was Leslie Mahaffey. The couple held Leslie captive, repeatedly assaulted her, while recording all of the attacks on tape. After less than 24 hours, Leslie was strangled, and then her body was cut up and dumped in the Lake Gibson. 2 weeks passed, and the couple got married, But on the same day as their wedding, fishermen found the cut-up body of Leslie Mahaffey. The connection between Leslie's murder and the Scarborough rapist was not yet made by police, and neither was the rapes in St. Catharines. Over the next 2 years, Carla lured in young girls who were mostly friends of Tammy. The girls would then be drugged, sexually assaulted, and abused by Paul. Unlike what happened with Tammy, the girls who were drugged all regained consciousness, with no memory of what happened to them the previous night. Most of these attacks were videotaped by Carla. On the 16th of April, 1992, Paul and Carla headed out to find their next victim. A couple miles away from the house, they saw 15-year-old Kristen French walking home from school. Paul and Carla drove into a church car park and waited for Kristen to walk past. Carla was sitting in the passenger seat, and as Kristen walked by, she called her over and asked for help with directions. Paul and Carla then pushed Kristen into the car and drove back to their house. But it wasn't long until Kristen was reported as missing to the police. Immediately, witnesses came forward confirming they had seen the abduction of Kristen. The couple kept Kristen captive for several days, torturing her, abusing her, and sexually assaulting her. The couple also forced Kristen to watch the videos of their previous victims while they filmed everything they did to her. Paul then strangled Kristen French, and it wasn't long until her naked body was found lying in a ditch 30 miles away from Paul and Carla's home. The abuse between Paul and Carla was getting more and more intense. One beating was so severe that Carla ended up in hospital. Finally, 2 years after Paul's DNA sample was taken, police found a match that Paul was the Scarborough rapist. When Carla was discharged from hospital, she decided to move out of the home. Police went to interview Carla about the domestic abuse, but the police brought with them the 2 detectives who were in charge of the Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French murders. The 2 detectives were very recognizable due to them being on the 2 recent murder cases. They were constantly on the news. Police only asked questions about the domestic abuse, but due to the 2 detectives being there, this conveyed a message to Carla that they knew something. After the interview, Carla broke down and confessed everything to her family. Carla was afraid the police already knew or were close to discovering the couple's terrible crimes. Carla got an attorney and admitted to all 3 murders, including her sister Tammy's, but she pinned it on Paul being abusive and forcing her to do it. Carla agreed to testify against Paul for the possibility of her sentence being reduced. Police arrested Paul and obtained a search warrant for his house. Carla told police about the videotapes of the murders and assaults. During a 71-day search of Paul's house, police could not find the videotapes Carla had mentioned, and this is all police had to go on for physical evidence. Carla was charged with manslaughter for the part she played in the murder of Leslie and Kristen. She was also given 2 12-year sentences, but was given nothing for the murder of Tammy. Paul pleaded not guilty to every charge against him, including murder, rape, and assault. The tapes were finally found in Paul's house, which showed that Carla had a lot more to do with the assaults than she was letting on, but by this point the plea deal was already made. Eventually, Paul was found guilty of all 9 charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder for Leslie Mahaffey and Christine French. At first, Paul was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years, but the judge labelled him as a dangerous offender. Carla has since left prison and has had a son. In my personal opinion, I do believe that Carla got off very lightly and should have been sentenced to more time in prison due to her part in the murders and assaults.